Davison was a young woman who joined the Suffragette Movement when it was starting to get militant. She was very much inspired by the words of leaders in the Suffragette Movement, such as Christabel Pankhurst or Emmeline Pankhurst. And Emily was a young woman from a sort of middle-class family, not very rich, and she was frustrated in her ambitions to get an education because they didn't have enough money. She joined the movement, she was very involved in the movement, and she's most famous for the fact that on the 4th of June 1913, she went down to protest at the Derby, which was a very important event in Edwardian England, and at Tattenham Corner on this sunny day at the Derby on the 4th of June 1913, whilst protesting, she fell under the horse and died a few days later. So she was treated as the martyr of the suffragette movements at the time. I think it was a really significant moment because there was a big funeral for Emily at the time. I think that she died at a time when the movement was becoming split between a more peaceful movement for parliamentary change and a more militant movement that was increasingly involved in acts of direct action and what we would call terrorism nowadays, actually, sort of political violence such as setting off bombs and breaking windows, disrupting political meetings. And Emily's, I think, act was quite significant because it brought the demands of the suffragettes to light, but it also showed the extent to which they were willing to make a sacrifice for what we considered to be just a very basic vote. And it shows that women at the time, British women, had to really fight to get changes to British parliamentary democracy. And it's quite interesting that Gandhi looked back on some of the tactics of the suffragette movement and based his own sort of peaceful form of direct action and resistance on British women who got the vote.
There's a lot of concern internationally at the moment about the need to increase the number of young people working in science, technology, engineering and maths, STEM industries. So STEM is important for two reasons. First, it's an important area for national economic competitiveness. STEM industries are predicted to grow in size over the coming years, so we need enough professionals to work in those areas. And secondly, we need it for scientific literacy. It's important as a society that we have people who can play a full role in active citizenship, who can understand scientific and technological developments. Both boys and girls tend to like science at school, and if anything, girls tend to like it a bit more than boys. But this doesn't translate into wanting to study science further in the future, or particularly wanting to follow careers in science. If anything, boys are slightly more likely to want to aspire to a career in science than girls. There are various reasons why girls don't see science as being for them. The first is that science careers are still very widely seen as quite masculine areas of work, which don't necessarily appeal to girls. In particular, we found that the more girly girls in our study are particularly unlikely to aspire to science careers. It doesn't seem to fit so much the idea of this sort of masculine career with what they see as normal or desirable ways of being a girl. Those girls who do aspire to science careers tend to be very academic and will often describe themselves to us as a bit less girly than some of their counterparts. So girls, in a way, have to do a lot more identity work to be able to reconcile the idea of science as something that might be appealing to them.
When the suffragettes fought for the women's rights to vote, the main purpose was, of course, to get political representation. That has changed. Nowadays, we also see women being represented in the workplace, and we have a big concern about where women are in the workplace. If you look at organizational hierarchies, you generally find that 50% of entry-level positions are filled by women these days. In mid-level positions, you find around 30% women, and top-level positions, really more than 10% of women. And that is across the board. Different industries, different sectors, all show a very similar representation, what we have termed in the past the 50-30-10 rule. We would have thought that by now, after all those years of women being in the labour market, women would have gained representation in the senior-most positions. However, their pathways are still blocked somehow, and there's a multitude of reasons that contributes to women not being represented that well. But what we have come to realise in our research is that in many of those cases, we are talking about much more subtle forms of discrimination than in the past. So women are not barred from entry into certain professions, but instead there are subtle stereotypes that persist and that hinder women to progress. There are many initiatives now that try to change the representation of women in senior positions, particularly on board level. So many initiatives now try to seek a higher representation of women in boards. We know that in Norway there has been a quota for women on boards. The European Union is currently preparing a similar proposal. And in the UK we are so far very resistant towards introducing quotas, but the quotas tend to show the results. So in Norway we not only see that more women are represented in top positions on boards, but also that they are more likely to be CEOs and more likely to be chairman of the board. So there has been some change.
Research on feminism for the last 7 years, maybe 7 to 8 years, and in particular I looked at how young women think, talk and feel about feminism. So I interviewed a diverse group of young women who were based in London and in Berlin, and I asked them about their views of feminism. They didn't think feminism was so important anymore. So whilst they were aware that there were still gender inequalities, they, for example, said that there's definitely still a gender pay gap, they thought they didn't need feminism. And they thought that because they felt that feminism was a collective movement, that it involved angry women going out on the streets and rioting and so on, and they didn't want to be associated with that. And instead they felt that they, as individuals, could change things themselves. So, for example, with regard to the pay gap, they would say, well, I'm just going to make sure I'm going to get paid as much as my male colleague. So there was a very individualized attitude towards gender inequalities.
In Parliament, the numbers started to go up a bit in the 80s, but the real breakthrough didn't come until the 1997 election. And that was in the Labour Party because they'd introduced all-women shortlists in a certain number of constituencies. And that was a desperate measure to get more women into Parliament. Of course, women have done much better in the Welsh and Scottish assemblies because women campaigned very hard when those were set up in 1999 for a system of voting, proportional representation system, that enabled more women to get in. And so Wales became the first elected assembly in the world to have 50-50 men and women. And Scotland had substantially more than Westminster. And it still does. I think it's now maybe about 23% in Westminster. And it's in the high 30s, I think, in Scotland and 40s in Wales. There's been progress in Westminster, but it's still very small. And I think we still only have 5 women cabinet ministers. It's difficult to know what Emily Davison would have expected to have happened 100 years in the future. But I do suspect she would have expected greater progress. I mean, women are still a majority of the population, so you would have expect more than 23% or so in Parliament. And more represented in big business firms, for example. Just more equal opportunities everywhere than we've actually got.
Looking ahead for 100 years' time, I'm hopeful that we would be able to see some change. This is an area that's of interest currently. We know there's a lot of political interest in trying to get more girls into STEM, and there's a lot of work that's being done and a lot of interventions that are being attempted. So I'm hopeful that some of those will have some effect, but I think we do have to learn the lessons of the last 100 years as well, and we can't just tinker around the edges here. I think that the issue is long-standing and is quite intractable, and I think really if we can get some wholesale structural changes in place, then that bodes well for the future.
I would hope that, they would look back in time and say, what were they on about 100 years ago? Why was there this inequality? Because by then, hopefully, societies have improved so much that gender inequality is a thing of the past. So, thinking back 200 years, women gained the right to vote, became more represented in the workplace. Today, we have subtle discrimination. So hopefully, in another 100 years' time, we will have made sure that inequality is eradicated.
I hope that differences between men and women in a way will become less significant. Women will feel less discriminated against or face less stereotypes. But I also hope very much hope that there'll be a deeper structural transformation where some of the values that women want in terms of work-life balance, or some of the ways in which they want to transform politics and employment and culture, are taken to be values that are important, that are actually end up setting a precedent for change, more deeper change within society as well. So what I'm hoping is the differences between men and women become less significant in 100 years' time.